stay upstairs for Isha, inshallah ta'ala.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everyone to the to the Friday Forum. For those that are here for the first time, the Friday Forum is a weekly event that happens every Friday night, where we discuss topics related to current issues. The event starts at 8 p.m. We're starting with a social session, and then we have some evening adhkar and dua, and after, right before Salat al-Maghrib, and then the main program usually starts right after Salat al-Maghrib. So as far as tonight, like the Shaykh said, we are discussing abortion in Islam. I'm going to ask the Shaykh a few questions about this topic, just to get his insights, and we also thought it would be beneficial to talk about this topic in light of the recent developments on this issue. We also would like to hear your feedback as well, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to text them to the number, and we'll try our best to answer those questions. So we'll go ahead and get started with the questions. So I guess as far as abortion, so Shaykh, why the subject? Why do you think it's important to discuss the subject?
Jazakallah khair, Akhi Na'il, for the introduction. So basically, some people by the title might get confused, like what's this discussion supposed to be about? Is it a fiqhi discussion? Is it a political discussion? Is it like a discussion on certain medical issues or social? What's the social context here, basically? Are we talking about it in the context of America? Is there a bigger discussion to be had here, or what? So I think, you know, for starters, of course, I think you were going to go over Roe versus Wade. How many of you have heard what happened last month? I think it was last month, or was it 2 months ago now?
Last month, yeah.
Yeah, so how many have actually heard what happened, raised by a show of hands? A good number of you guys have heard it. You know, so basically, it was Roe versus Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court. Is that right?
Yes.
So I think you said you looked into it a little bit. What did you find?
Yeah, so just to give some overview about the U.S. laws as it relates to abortion. In 1973, so this was about 50 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that abortion is protected by the U.S. Constitution, which basically means that a woman has a right to an abortion, and it's protected by the U.S. government. And when the U.S. Supreme Court passes a ruling, it applies at a federal level, which means that all 50 states need to follow this ruling. So last month, the Supreme Court overruled Roe versus Wade on the basis that abortion is not protected. It is not protected by the U.S. Constitution. The Supreme Court felt that it's best to leave this decision to be handled at a state level. And I think the one thing that's really important to mention is that there's a lot of discussions, and there was a lot of controversy about it. The Supreme Court ruling doesn't prohibit abortion, Shaykh.
Yeah.
It just means that it's not protected at the federal level, and it's really up to the states to decide what is best for each state. But when that ruling was passed, when Roe versus Wade was overturned, there was a lot of controversy. There was a lot of debates in the U.S. and there was actually a lot of debates among the Muslims in the U.S. about, you know, whether this decision made sense.
Jazakallah khair for that context. By the way, I just want to remind everyone about the number over there. Please feel free to text your comments, questions throughout our discussion. Na'il is going to be reading whatever you guys send, inshallah ta'ala, that's relevant to this discussion. So please make it relevant to this. But Jazakallah khair for that context. So basically, that's the context of why the subject was chosen. Now, of course, this is not going to be a political discussion because I'm not a political science major. Nor is it going to be a medical discussion because I'm not a specialist in that field either. But there are parts of those discussions that are important to our understanding of this subject, I should say. So I also, basically, this subject of Roe versus Wade historically comes up in the second wave of feminism. And there's something really important here to understand about the history of our country in terms of the civil rights movement and where the feminist movement fits into that. They mention that there are waves of feminism. First wave, and of course feminism by itself is something we'll discuss on another day, but it relates to what we're going to discuss here in a sense. So we're not discussing, am I mentioning it in a negative light or a positive light? No, we're not talking about any of that right now. We're just talking about something purely historical. Is feminism something positive or negative? Are there good things? Are there bad things? Is there things that align with Islam? Are there things that are against it? Leave it for another day, inshallah. But first wave feminism, what they historically say, is basically all about suffrage and the right to vote and gender roles. That's first wave. If you look it up, you'll find this, 4 waves of feminism. The second wave was all about equal rights, about domestic violence, about abortion. By the way, the second wave, they say, is in the 60s and 70s. That's when Roe versus Wade was passed. And Roe, by the way, is the pseudonym that was given for the woman. Her name was not Jane Roe, but that's what they called her, the pseudonym. Her name was actually Norma McCorvey. She was from Texas. She had 2 children. This third child, she didn't want him. She didn't want this third child. And Wade was her local district attorney. That's why it's called Roe versus Wade. Jane Roe, this woman basically, versus her local district attorney, because she felt that the prohibition of abortion was against her constitutional rights. So that's what it was historic. That's the second wave. The third wave was in the 90s, and it was a little bit more about other minorities, women of color, and other things. There's like a lot of detail. I'm not going to get into that really. The fourth wave is what we now know today as the Me Too movement. That's the fourth wave of feminism, the Me Too movement. So that's a little bit of historical context there. And the historical context is really important because when we discuss the fiqhi ruling, fiqh, Islamic law, is not something that you could understand in a vacuum, right? There's fiqh, and then there's tanzil al-fiqh al-waqi'. There's application of fiqh to context, right? Application of fiqh to context. It's really important not to be irresponsible in just mentioning matters of halal and haram without understanding what is driving people to their understandings, or what is driving people to their perception of their reality, right? So that's the purpose of that. Now, for me, the main objective behind this type of gathering is actually not just going over the laws of abortion and fiqh, even though we're going to do that. But it's something more than that. For me, it's more about reconstructing the mind. And what I mean by reconstructing the mind is, how should we as Muslims begin to process things through the lens of our Islam? How should we see things through the lens of what Allah wants from us? Through the lens of seeking His pleasure? How can we begin to decipher the matters occurring in our reality with nuance? You guys know what I mean by nuance? What do I mean by nuance? Anyone? Detail, right? If you look at everything around you, you see a great deal of intricate design. A lot of design, a lot of detail, and a lot of things to distinguish in terms of their colors and their shapes and their appearance and so on and so forth. And the same thing goes for understanding the rulings of our deen, it should be taken with a great deal of nuance. And one of the dangers that happens is people, because of labeling, because I label myself as a liberal, or I label myself as a conservative, or I support this party or that party, or I'm for this idea or that idea, I begin to have a very destructive approach in my discourse. I begin to eye things through a very, very, very small lens, and I can't see bigger picture. So that's really my hope, Akhi Na'il, through this type of discussion. How can we see bigger picture? How can we begin to operate and deal with hot topic issues in a more meaningful way? Instead of, okay, by the end of this discussion, what are we going to conclude? Are we supposed to, as Muslims, be pro-life or pro-choice? That type of attitude is very simplistic, and it's a very reductionist approach to something that's really complex. Allahu A'lam.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. So, while you're talking about the bigger picture, can you help us talk about a little about what are the sides to the discussion? What are the different moving parts in this discussion?
Well, I think I kind of addressed them already, about the fiqh aspect of it, then the political aspect of it, the political/historical aspect of it, the social aspect of it, and some of the medical issues that can come up in this type of discussion. So those are the sides of the conversation. Please, in the far corner, sisters, I could hear you. Jazakumullah khair. Please keep it down. Barakallah feekum.
Okay. So maybe let's kind of dig into it a little bit more. So when it comes to the topic of abortion in the U.S., there's the topic usually there's two sides of the spectrum. You're either pro-choice or you're pro-life. Those are really you hear a lot of discussions about using these two terms. Can you just help us just define what pro-choice and pro-life mean?
I'm sure it's a really big issue, and I don't want to reduce either side of their arguments. I'm not really trying to champion either side, as we said before, because what we're trying to do here is actually do something much, much, much more meaningful. And that is, how can I begin to approach things differently? But I guess just to give some of the arguments that are commonly, we said, for example, the pro-choice side of it, you're going to see between pro-choice and pro-life a very clear divide between conservatives and liberals. And you're going to, on the pro-choice side, of course, seeing the feminist movement as a primary driver behind the push for contraceptives being allowed, and the push for abortion being widely accepted and allowed and facilitated. Of course, you're going to find them on that pro-choice side. For the arguments for pro-choice, you're going to commonly see out there, it's a safe medical procedure, it protects lives, people are going to get abortions anyway, but this is just a way to make it safer so that it doesn't endanger them. Abortion bans deny a person's autonomy over their own body. That's why you saw the slogans coming out, my body, my choice. Those are the pro-choice arguments. And then the pro-life arguments are going to be life begins at conception, and abortion is murder, and legal abortion promotes a culture in which life is disposable. You're disregarding life. Those are the arguments that you would commonly find out there by the pro-life side of it. So I think that's what you'd find out there,
Jazakallah khair. So how should Muslims in America think about these terms? Can Muslims in this day and age, just given what you described about these two areas, these two terms, these two sides, I should say, how should Muslims think about this? Can Muslims support either of these positions?
Well, look, I think, as I said before about reconstructing the mind, I think if I was to try to reduce Islam to either side of this discussion, I would be doing a huge disservice to, because you know the teachings of our deen on this subject actually predate this political and social reality. Of course, you guys all know that. From hundreds and hundreds of years ago, even from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, we had guidance on this type of issue without the political baggage and the social baggage that came along with it. And you know, this is part of the discussion about reconstructing the mind. There's actually an interesting statistic. I got this. You know, there's a few good videos out there, by the way, you could listen to for more detail. And, you know, mashallah, you know, some shuyukh spent some time picking apart the different aspects of this. There's an interview between Shaykh Yasir Qadi and Dr. Hatim al-Hajj. There's also a Yaqeen podcast on the issue. There's also, specifically about Roe versus Wade, Shaykh Yasir Qadi also has a shorter video. And I'm sure there's others. But one of the interesting statistics I did find, this is from the National Library of Medicine, that you know, one of its main conclusions, it says, while abortion rates were highest for single women, this is talking about from 1974 to 94, 20 years, while abortion rates were highest for single women, those who were married accounted for over 1/4, 25% of all abortions performed in 1994. And then there's more details in the statistics they mentioned, but you know, one of the profound aspects of this discussion that needs attention is the subject must incorporate Islam's perspective, or Islam's guidance, I should say, on sexual expression, on experiencing sexuality outside of the realm of marriage. Because most of the abortion cases in our context are actually being fueled by society's approach to sexuality, which in our belief as Muslims is absolutely destructive. So before I get into the discussion about, okay, where should Muslims be on the pro-life side or the pro-choice side, let me figure out what's fueling this reality anyway. Why is this such a hot topic issue? Are we mostly talking about situations which people have life-threatening circumstances, or where they are having the risk of children being born with deformities or something else of the sort, some other medical circumstances? That's not usually the case. Usually what's driving it is the society's approach to sexuality, having teen pregnancies. They're on the rise, through the roof actually, even in the Muslim community. By the way, even in the Muslim community, too many people hardly make it to marriage without making certain mistakes along the way, and maybe even having those mistakes lead to pregnancies that they need to figure out how to abort so they could hide it from their families, so that they could avoid some, you know, sense of shame or public backlash from their cultural circles and so on and so forth. That's really where the discussion is. Where is the condition of society in terms of sexuality, and how that's being proliferated in shows, in movies, how people are encouraged to engage in relationships, illicit relationships from our perspective. Really, that solves the bulk of this issue. You know, for us as Muslims at least. For us as Muslims, it solves the bulk of that issue, because our deen really, really encourages and guides us to make sure that our sexuality is had through a halal relationship that's meant for the purpose of procreation, that's meant for the purpose of tanasul and takathur. So that's why when you talk about the subject of sanctity of life, it just brings all that to light. You know, how am I conceiving this, and how are those around me perceiving it? How are those, you know, when you're talking about someone who feel like they made a mistake, they experienced their sexuality with a horrible human being, guy or girl, mostly guy if you're talking about the woman seeking abortion. I experienced it with a horrible human being, and this is going to happen to me if I don't abort, and I'm afraid of that, and I'm concerned about that, and I know this child's not going to have a father, X, Y, and Z, and so on and so forth. I'm not ready to be a mother. All these concerns could be under control just by addressing this issue. Wallahu alam.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. So I think you briefly mentioned about the sanctity of life. This issue that we're talking about, it's not just reduced to political, or it's not really
just
reduced
move
to
the front piece. If you could just move it that way a little, because I see Ridwan peeking behind. Okay, there you go.
So I was saying that this issue is not just reduced to something at either a political level or at a social level, or even just from a regulatory level. You are talking about a human life, right? You're talking about preserving a human life. So can you just talk briefly about the sanctity of life in Islam?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Look, I think, every parent will tell you that raising a child is an immense undertaking. It's something that requires a lot of responsibility. And, sometimes some people might feel that they're not ready for that responsibility. Having another human being under your care is a supreme responsibility and a position of accountability before Allah Azza wa Jal. And of course, this actually starts off with marriage, because sometimes the responsibility starts there. That's am I ready for marriage? Everyone, whether guy or girl wants to get married, but am I ready for marriage? The question needs a lot of thought, because it needs a lot of responsibility to be in a position where I'm actually going to be caring for another human being. Because if I don't give that responsibility the way it should be, then I might be falling into oppression and wrongdoing. I might actually be setting myself up for immense accountability before Allah Azza wa Jal. That's just about marriage. Then when you second that with raising a child, sanctity of life, Allah Azza wa Jal speaks about it in the Quran. الْمَالُ وَالْبَنُونَ زِينَةُ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. They are the adornment. Children are the adornment of this life. Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, we spoke about him recently because of the Hijjah. He lived a lifetime without a child. And he was someone who Allah Azza wa Jal trained to be detached from any material association. And that's why when he was given a child in old age, Sayyidina Ismail, he was ordered to sacrifice him. And that's an immense trial, and it brings to the, and his reactions show that. His reactions, like, when he wanted to get his child on board, إِنِّي أَرَى فِي الْمَنَامِ أَنِّي أَذْبَحُكَ فَانظُرْ مَاذَا تَرَى, and the story goes on. His reactions show the immensity of the trial. And that's why Allah Azza wa Jal says about Ibrahim alayhi salam, after he fulfilled the command, إِنَّ هَذَا لَهُوَ الْبَلَاءُ الْمُبِينُ. This is indeed the most evident trial. Ibrahim alayhi salam was put through that. So when it comes to, this dunya is kind of strange, Akhi Na'il, because when it comes to sanctity of life and appreciating that miracle in existence, you'll find that there are people with children wishing they could just get rid of them, finding some way, I just don't want this responsibility anymore. And then there are other people who live their lives wishing they could have the ni'mah of a child. And I think it's important to mention that when we're talking about the subject of abortion and people really fighting for the quote-unquote right to abort. And I think the preciousness of childbirth is amplified in what you see people trying to do. Science today, with its advancements, with IVF, people who can't have children for some reason or another, through this medical procedure, may be able to have a child. And people pay tens of thousands of dollars for that. I remember more than one case coming to me where the great test was in, I've tried IVF multiple times and it's not working. I tried it. I remember there was one sister, she said, this is our 4th time and trying IVF, and it's taken a massive toll on our marriage, and please make dua, it works this time. And subhanallah, some while later, she actually texted me, alhamdulillah, Allah blessed me with a child, and she was so overjoyed. But 4 attempts at IVF, you're talking about tens and tens of thousands of dollars just to have a child.
SubhanAllah.
Ya Allah. And then when you look at other realities where people, Allah blesses them with not only 1 child, but 2, 3, 4, or 5, and then they neglect them, they disregard them, they see them as a source of torment in their life. Wal-'iyadhu billah. So that's where I see the discussion about sanctity of life.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that some people that they have kids, right? They have kids, and the woman gets pregnant, and then she's considering aborting. Can we maybe just talk a little bit more about that in terms of how can someone think about it from a tawakkul standpoint? How can someone put their trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when they are put in that situation? Like, how can we tie in tawakkul ala Allah with this this conversation?
Trust in Allah, right? Tawakkul, trust in Allah. Jazakallah khair for that question. That's a good point. Of course, what I said in the beginning is absolutely not meant to diminish the fact that some people are actually in really difficult situations because they find themselves with a partner that's unreliable, a partner that they cannot trust, and they're worried about their ability to be able to raise this kid alone. They're worried about being tied down in a relationship that might be abusive or oppressive, which is very true. So of course none of this was meant to diminish that, because some people are really torn. If I continue to have this child, that means I'm probably going to be locked into this relationship, and I'm not sure I want to be locked into this relationship. That's the dilemma for some people. So when it comes to the subject of tawakkul and trust in Allah, it's absolutely, absolutely important to keep that in mind, and actually to allow that to accompany you in every decision that you make. Because at every juncture, even throughout the process, if someone has no tawakkul, no trust, no sense of patience, no sabr, then really they have no sense of faith. That's the foundation of it, basically, because to get married to someone, you're taking a big risk. Might work, might not work. Might be toxic, might be your heaven, right? And then to follow that with having a child, you might be tested with, of all forms of things that take a toll on your iman and put your iman to the test. Will this child be healthy? The doctors might tell you, oh, your child might have Down syndrome, or your child might be on the autistic scale, or this might go wrong, or that might go wrong, or all kinds of complications that might come throughout the process that all reinforce this idea. If there is no tawakkul, then forget about it. The person's going to be in an utter state of jaza' and discomfort and frustration in all of life's junctures. Wallahu a'lam.
Jazakallah khair. So let's kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the Islamic rulings when it comes to abortion. So, Shaykh, I did a little bit of reading on this, and doing a little bit of reading on when it comes to fiqh of abortion does not do it justice. There's a lot of facts and circumstances that need to be considered when ruling on this matter. So, and like the Shaykh said, it's very nuanced, so it's really important to consider the facts and circumstances for each case. So Shaykh, can you talk maybe a little bit about some of the facts and circumstances that need to be considered when it comes to determining whether or not an abortion is allowed?
Yeah, sure. I guess before going over the rulings, there are a few important things that everyone really should know about the subject of abortion from an Islamic standpoint. First thing is, and when it comes to hadith, there are two hadiths that we all should know about. The first hadith is the hadith of Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. This hadith is in the 40 Nawawis. It's a very well-known hadith. It mentions this 120-day period. The hadith mentions as follows, إِنَّ أَحَدَكُمْ يُجْمَعُ خَلْقُهُ فِي بَطْنِ أُمِّهِ 40 يَوْمًا نُطْفَةً ثم يكون علقة مثل ذلك ثم يكون مضغة مثل ذلك ثم يرسل إليه ملك فينفخ فيه الروح. So the hadith says the following: you are the creation of one of you develops in the womb of the mother for 40 days as a nutfa, as a drop. ثم يكون علقة مثل ذلك. Then you be a clinging clot of blood for a similar duration. ثم يكون مضغة مثل ذلك. Then you are into a lump of flesh for a similar duration. ثم يرسل إليه الملك. So 40, 40, 40. Then the ensoulment happens. The angel comes, and the angel is commanded to write four things. To write the rizq, the provisions, and to write the ajal, the lifespan, and to write the amal, the actions that this person will do. And then the last thing is, وَشَقِيٌّ أَوْ سَعِيدٌ. Will this person be wicked or upright? Those are the four things. And the Prophet ﷺ goes on to continue the hadith. So, by the one who there is no Lord but Him, one of you continues to do with the actions of the people of Jannah until you're only an arm's length away. فَيَسْبِقْ عَلَيْهِ الْكِتَابِ. Then the decree comes upon him, and he does from the actions of people of hellfire, and he enters it. And you know the rest of the hadith. The end part of the hadith is very well known. It's often referenced. So this is one hadith. This is the hadith of who? Which companion narrated it? Who? No, Abdullah. It seems like most people are sleeping. Are you guys with me? Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, one of the companions of the Prophet, he narrates this hadith that mentions what the scholars understand as a 120-day duration. There's another hadith, also an authentic hadith. It's the hadith of Hudhayfa. And this hadith mentions a 42-day duration. Explicitly, it says, إِذَا مَرَّ بِالنُّطْفَةِ 42 يوما ليلة بعث الله إليها ملكا فصورها وخلق سمعها وبصرها وجلدها ولحمها وعظامها ثم قال يا رب أذكر أم أنثى فيقضي ربك ما شاء ويكتب الملك. So here I'm going to translate this hadith is in Sahih Muslim, authentic hadith, stating that when 42 days pass upon a nutfa, then nutfa being the drop, as we said, Allah will send to it an angel, and it will then give it human form. It will begin to shape into human form until the end of the hadith. And the hadith mentions, is it a male or a female? The angel asks. And then what is its ajal? What is its lifespan? What is going to be its rizq? This is the second hadith. It's the hadith of who? Hadith of who? Hudhayfa. What's the duration? 42 days. So we have 120, we have 42 days, and then the last thing before I give you an explanation and a reconciliation between these reports is a verse in the Quran. It gives us the stages of embryogenesis in the Quran. What does the Quran say? It's in Surah Al-Mu'minun. Allah Azza wa Jal says, then we developed the drop into a clinging clot of blood. So we have nutfa, alaqa, right? Clinging clot of blood. And then what? Then developed the clot into a lump of flesh, a mudgha. That's the third one. Then developed the lump into bones. ثم خلقنا المضغة عظاما. Then we made it into bones. And then clothed the bones with flesh. فكسونا العظام لحما. Then we've given the, so what number is this? Number 5. Number 120? What? No, the stages of embryogenesis. So here, drop, clinging clot, lump of flesh, bones, and then clothe the bones with flesh. Then what? ثُمَّ أَنشَأْنَاهُ خَلْقًا آخَرَ. Then we brought it into being as a new creation. That's nafkh al-ruh. That's ensoulment. That's an important word to remember, ensoulment. So basically, when you talk about from a medical standpoint, they mention embryogenesis. What's embryogenesis? That's the stages in which an embryo develops, right? It's the process of development of an embryo, from a zygote to all the rest, or a somatic cell, as they mention. So that's embryogenesis in the Quran. Now, what does ensoulment mean? Ensoulment means nafkh al-ruh. Now, when does ensoulment happen exactly? This is something we don't have a clear-cut answer in the Quran or in the Sunnah about. When does nafkh al-ruh exactly happen? Is it with 120 days? Is it with 40 or 42 days? But what did scientific discovery show us? It does not, the stages of the embryo does not last for 120 days. That's definitely not the case. So then how can I reconcile and understand these two hadiths? It doesn't last for but a 120-day period, you're talking about the fetus already, way beyond the fetus taking form. They say that after 56 days of gestation, the embryo begins to take human form. This is way before 120 days. So now there's just another mustalah, another terminology that we need to mention here. And this, you could find this all, by the way, in Dr. Hatim's interview with Shaykh Yasir Qadi. And one of the unique things about Dr. Hatim is he's also a medical doctor. So he gives the explanation from both standpoints. So there is something called gestational age, and then there's something called fetal age. And I think if you go through a pregnancy, you learn about this, that gestational age basically means they're 2 weeks apart. But gestational age basically starts counting the age of the fetus from the last menstrual period. It's not from the age of conception. It's from the last menstrual period, because for medical purposes and for the purposes of delivery, that's more accurate. But the fetal age, that's when they calculate it from the date of conception, and that's basically when the last ovulation was, not when the last menstrual period was. So they're 2 weeks apart. So this is really important. When you come to mention 42 days, you add to that the 2 weeks, it starts to make sense medically. And that's why this hadith of Hudhayfa, they say, the second hadith I mentioned, the one that mentions 42 days, actually makes sense in terms of embryogenesis, in terms of what? The nutfa developing into a alaqa, into a mudgha. This stage, when it's still an embryo, before it's a fetus, that makes sense, because 42 days in gestation would equal 56 days. And at that point, it would start taking form of a human. Now, the early forms, of course, but everything would be there by then in terms of the vital organs and all of that. Now, I don't mean to, make it too complicated or complex, but these are important terms to understand so that I could understand, what the Prophet ﷺ said. So what's this 120? What's this 120 thing? It's an authentic hadith. How can I understand that? They say that the 120, this is one of the opinions that's out there, is the date of ensoulment, is nafkh al-ruh. There is no clear-cut statement in our deen that nafkh al-ruh, ensoulment, happens when it's still an embryo, when it's forming. There's nothing to state that. So that's why you'll have a spectrum of opinions. And there's some, and Dr. Hatim actually leans towards this. Dr. Hatim, one of the things he mentions is, they monitor, they've studied when do voluntary movements start happening for a fetus. Some of them say at 16 weeks, 18 weeks. How many months is that? 16 weeks is how many months? 4 months. 18, it would be 4 months and a half. That's when the baby starts having voluntary movements. The baby starts kicking, moving, when it's not just a reflex or a reaction, right? So there's actually cognitive development there, that the baby starts moving. So that's an important thing. So for this reason, to reconcile between these two hadiths, you'll have a spectrum of opinion. And again, I want to take this back to what we said in the beginning. Nuance. You see a notion of detail here, right? And this is beautiful, actually, because it starts making it more about, the maslahah that Allah has inspired human beings with. It makes it more about divine guidance. It starts making the discussion away from the political divide, the social divide, into actually examining when there's life, when there isn't, when trust in Allah should take effect, to the fullest, and when some element of choice is there for people to have when it comes to these issues. So now I'm just going to give you a rundown. Before 40 days or 42 days, the majority of scholars actually allow abortion. Some of them say even without cause, even without there being a reason. It's something that is mubah mutlaqan before 40 days, of the fetal age, 40 days of the fetal age, from conception, not the gestational age. So before 40 days, the majority of scholars allow it. A portion of them allow it without cause. But even at this stage, there are a good number of scholars that require there needs to be a cause to abort a fetus. Now, one of the schools, the Maliki school, actually is very strict on the subject of contraception and abortion. It doesn't allow it at all. Even before 40 days, it doesn't allow it at all. It prohibits it altogether. That's why you see, are Muslims pro-life or pro-choice, right? You see a detailed spectrum here. It's not something political. It's not something gender-driven. It's not about men imposing their will on women, or women, or it being a cause for women's freedom, or so on and so forth. The Malikis, the only thing they allow is the pull-out method, coitus interruptus, that's what they call it here. The use of the pull-out method, and this is interesting actually, I found this as I was looking it up, is actually something that's makruh. We call this in Arabic al-azl. It's makruh because there's an element, can you do it? Yes, you can, under certain conditions. But, and this is basically a form of it's a form of contraception. What do we mean by contraception? Basically doing something to try to limit the possibility of getting pregnant. Is it halal to do that? Is it halal for me to plan for a pregnancy? The short answer is yes, in a sense. Yes, in a sense. So this type of thing would be allowed, but it would be makruh, but it's conditional here. And this was one of the things that I found that was really interesting. It needs to be by mutual consent. It needs to be by mutual consent. In order for someone to do this, both husband and wife need to be in agreement about it. Meaning to have intimacy, not for the purpose of having children, needs to be an area of agreement. That's because there's a hadith in the Prophet ﷺ in which he says, as hadith is in Musnad Imam Ahmad, that نهى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أن يعزل الرجل عن الحرة إلا بإذنها. That there needs to be certain permission that the wife gives the husband, or the husband gives the wife, that we're going to do some type of contraception to avoid getting pregnant, right? This is really important. This is what our deen teaches us. Are these things, again, this is for husbands and wives. You guys all following along with me? Who understood what I just said? Raise your hand and can repeat it. What did I just say? No pressure. The husband and wife need to agree that they don't want to have children and they're going to do some type of contraception, azl, or something else, right? That goes both ways, meaning the husband can't just decide on his own, and the woman also cannot just decide on her own. If they do this, it would be haram. They would be committing some type of forbidden act. It would be haram. It would be a sin. And the guy would be told, you need to fear Allah if you're doing that, because the woman has a haqq, a right in having a child. Just as the man has a right, haqq, in having a child. And if either one deny this right, they're doing something sinful. Now, that brings, that should, that should be a shocker for a lot of people. Because a lot of people see this discussion as very binary. It's my body, I should be able to choose it. And no one else should have any say in the matter. Now, of course,
just someone had a question. It's related to a little. I don't know if I should say it, but I guess, does this mean condoms are haram, or can just while we're talking about this?
No, it doesn't mean that condoms are a form of contraception,
right.
And that would be halal with the permission of your spouse. Okay. If it's without the permission and against their will, then of course you'd be doing something haram.
Okay.
You get it? Alright, so now here's something else. After 40 days until 120. So again, we said before 40 days, what's the ruling? What's the ruling before 40 days? Most scholars allow it. Most scholars allow, except the Maliki school. Some of them say without cause, some of them make a cause. Now, after 40 days until 120 days, the Hanafi and Shafi'i school allow it, but some scholars today urge that this is limited to very valid causes, like rape, or there being some type of congenital disease, like a deformity the child's born with, a severe one. Severe congenital disease. This is really important, Akhi Nail. So 40 days to 100. Why do they have this? Why? What is this based on? Take a wild guess. Take a wild guess, sir. Why do some scholars then say it's allowed from 40 to 120? Why do you think? You have your hand raised in the back. Go ahead. Oh, it's because of ensoulment, right? That nafkh al-ruh, that word that we used, right? Based on the hadith of Ibn Mas'ud, they say ensoulment happens by 120 days. Yes, The embryo may fully develop, and it does fully develop because it's scientifically proven in those 42 days of fetal age. But then nafkh al-ruh happens later on, based on the other hadith. So they'll say that a woman could abort all the way until 120 days, but some of them urge to limit this to a very good cause, like rape. Because again, this is one of the arguments, right? If you're going to prohibit abortion, that means you're going to force a woman who was raped to have a child from that rape. That's not fair. Well, you know what? Our deen, alhamdulillah, because it's not gender-driven, because it's not by a human being, because it's not to serve a certain political agenda, it could do that. Because again, it's not for any of those causes. It's actually, it's actually for the purpose of guidance, and the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ sets that, so this is an evidence for it. Wallahu alam. So this is 40 to 120. Now we need to be cautious here though, because sometimes, the doctors will say, oh, this child has a strong likelihood, or this child will have Down syndrome. This child will be autistic. And you know what? I've heard so many cases where people have that tawakkul you were talking about, akhi na'il, and they give birth to the child, and the child's absolutely fine. I personally have heard of multiple cases like that, where of course the doctors have to share the probability and the possibility of there being, just so that you're not blindsided and you make a decision for yourself, right? But many times that doesn't come out to be the case. So it needs to be, before 120 days, it needs to be severe disease that would, make life impossible for the parents or for the child. Then it would be allowed. You have a question? According to some scholars, yes. According to the schools, they put it by the day, because ensoulment happens by 120 days. So according to some, even if it's not for a very good cause, but you should be really careful with this, because again, the general guidance of Sharia is very much about preserving the sanctity of life, is very much encouraging people to embrace this blessing from Allah Azza wa Jal. Actually, especially when it comes to some of those causes, because sometimes some people say, oh, I'm not ready to be a parent. Or I don't have the finances to support another kid. And Allah prohibits thinking like this. This is an aqeedah issue. If a person thinks, I don't want to have a kid because I don't have enough money, right? Because وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُمْ خَشْيَةَ إِمْلَاقٍ. Don't kill your children out of fear of poverty, right? That's haram. That's a bad perception. It doesn't speak well to a person's faith if that's a reason why they're aborting. Or it doesn't speak well to the person's trust in Allah if any medical concern causes them to go crazy. They tell them the child's going to have Down syndrome or be autistic, and that's it. They just abandon all hope and they just abort the child, right? So I think it makes sense to limit this as best as possible to something that's a really good. Another evidence in Islam that Islam really sanctifies life. If someone aborts in a case they're not allowed to, then it's considered a sin, and along with that, it's considered something that has what they call a ghurra. A ghurra is damages and reparations for taking the life of that child, right? Again, so according to the Hanbali position, they're the ones who say ensoulment happens at 42 days. They're one opinion that many scholars today lean towards because of the embryogenesis thing. But those are some things to consider. In some situations that are really difficult, there are these opinions that say that up until 120 days, you're allowed to abort, even if there's no serious case. Wallahu alam. There's only one ruling left, And that is what happens after 120 days. What happens after 120 days? After 120 days, it is haram, it is absolutely prohibited to abort a pregnancy by consensus. There's no scholarly difference about that, except in one issue, one situation. Guess when? Yeah, exactly. When it poses a serious danger to the life of the mother. That's the only case that is allowed at that point. Otherwise, it's haram by ijma'. It's a sin. In our deen, that's what our deen teaches. If both could be saved, then that's necessary. You know, like say if there's danger to the mother, but we could possibly save the child, like through a C-section, and that has happened as early as I think from what I read, the earliest born fetus that was, alive and well was a little after 21 weeks. 21 weeks. This extreme prenatal birth is from 21, I think, to 25, they say, and then moderate is, I think, 25 after that. So anyway, but that could happen. A C-section could happen at that, and that's at how many months is that? 21? 5 months and some change, right? So, yeah, right? So that's about that last situation. If the doctor says there is a high risk, what if the doctor comes and tells you, hey, look, you can give birth to this fetus, or to this baby, to this fetus, but it's not going to live. And this is after the 120 days. What do I do? After that, I just have tawakkul. And I do whatever is in my power, and whatever is Allah's qadr is going to happen. Can I abort? No, I cannot abort. Again, for me, the bigger issue with this subject is more about the social and political driver behind it. Many people, because it's not really about the subject of abortion, because in most cases, again, we're saying that a lot of these abortions are happening from single women. And it's coming from a culture of promiscuity and a culture of sexual expression outside of marriage. When it's in the context of marriage, it still could happen. It still does happen, but it's in a much more limited capacity. The bigger subject here is many Muslims, because they box themselves, and this is a really important subject, Akhi Na'il, to pay attention to. Many Muslims, they box themselves into a small category. I'm liberal. I'm a Democrat, right? I'm progressive. So that means I have to support 1, 2, 3, 4 because of that. I'm conservative, so I have to support 1, 2, 3, 4 because of that. And it's, of course, a very backward approach. A very twisted approach. No, my deen guides me on how to really deal with these issues in a meaningful way. I should never accept a rhetoric and an approach that is solely driven by political alliances, social alliances, not really about principles and values that stem from the guidance of my deen. That's Wallah Alam.
Yeah, and it's also, to your point, it's narrow-minded as well. So just to summarize the Islamic rulings, and there's going to be a quiz after this, so I hope everybody's going to pay attention. So maybe we can start backwards. So if it's greater than 120 days, I think the Shaykh said, like the Shaykh said,
let them answer.
All right, let's give them answer. So if it's greater than 120 days, what's the ruling?
Don't speak all at once. No, say, Yalla, you should know this. After 120 days, what? It is haram, except for if she's at a real serious danger to her life.
I think both the brothers and the sisters got that one correct.
Okay.
What do you think, Shaykh?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So between 40 days and 120 days, what's the ruling?
A number of scholars allowed abortion until 120 days, which is 4 months. Why? Because ensoulment happens, nafkh al-ruh happens at 120 days. Some scholars say you should limit this to situations where there's a really good cause. All right? Yeah, nafkh al-ruh is different than the heartbeat. Yeah, it's different. So the heartbeat is part of the embryo's development, right? It's part of the embryo's development. Now, the nafkh al-ruh is something only known to Allah. وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. They ask you about the soul, say the soul is from the affairs of my Lord. So we don't have clear-cut guidance. Some of them say that nafkh al-ruh happens with the 42 days. And for that reason, they say you can't abort after 42 days. The others, they say, no, there's a hadith that says 120 days, and it's an authentic hadith. So that must be when ensoulment happens, nafkh al-ruh happens. So, Allah alam. Yeah. And some of the evidence that proves that is you don't find voluntary movement from the child as early as 42 days. You don't find it until way later on, after the 4-month period. Yes. Yeah. Is it from Allah's ruh? Of course, the ruh. No. So it's from Allah's command. What does it mean, Allah's ruh? How does that happen? This is from ilm al-ghayb. Where does the ruh come from? But Allah says, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي, I've given him of my soul. What does my soul mean? It means it's from the creation of Allah. And Allah directs it as He sees fit. What? Yeah, the haqiqah of that is min ilm al-ghayb. لا يمكن أن نعرفه. Yeah, we don't know anything about it. No. Yeah. Any other questions?
And then the last one was before 40 days, what's the ruling on that?
Most scholars say it's allowed. Most scholars. Yes. Yes. Yes.
All right. Jazakumullah khair. So, I guess
were there any other questions about the subject?
No, there's some questions about our next question, which is about...
So wait, now let's take a step here. So now you have this information and this guidance. Now, as we already said, does Islam make you pro-life or pro-choice? No, the Islam transcends this discussion. It's beyond that. There are certain situations where Islam gives this directive, and then there are other situations where Islam gives that directive, right? Now, I'm equipped with this information. What am I supposed to do with it? Are we trying to say that by saying this, we as Muslims in a Muslim community need to push for certain laws that are in this direction or that direction? No, that's not what we're saying at all, right? Please, no one misunderstand that. Because obviously you could see on every level, this discussion is more complicated than that. Even, by the way, Akhi Nail, about the whole, permission thing. Even on that, there is fiqhi nuance relating to it. As we said, it should be a consensual thing from husband and wife. There are some scholars that say that the decision of abortion is actually for the wife. So this rhetoric of my body, my choice, does it necessarily conflict with some of the teachings in Islamic law? No, not necessarily. Islamic law is a very complex and dynamic system. But what drives this thought, how should I perceive it? No, that could be coming from a place that could be very destructive. A polarizing reality between genders, between husband and wife. And that's of course not what we're looking for. But so again, just trying to emphasize here, I'm equipped with this information, what am I supposed to do with it? The whole idea behind this session is what? Is for me to reorient myself. What do I mean reorient myself? I'm not going to stop I'm not going to continue to deal with things in binaries. I need to be on this side of the fence or that side of the fence. I need to support this group or that group. I'm going to reorient myself in a different way. That my Islam teaches me to take a step back and look at things with more detail, with more nuance. You know what, if I do that with every other issue, I'm going to find myself actually attaining a level of understanding. Whether it's you're talking about issues relating to gender or issues relating to gender roles or the LGBTQ movement, like we spoke about in a previous week, or speaking about other hot topic issues like drinking alcohol or smoking marijuana. If I start looking at all those issues from a different standpoint, take a step back, let me look at all the details. You know, let me see, who was here for the talk about the LGBTQ+? Raise your hand. You guys remember the 3 caps? Let's see who remembers. This is not easy to remember this. Who remembers the 3 caps?
This is the quiz.
Huh? Huh? Wow. Okay, da'wah. Social/spiritual, right? All right. Is the fiqhi legal ruling of it, right? Those are 3 caps. You remember what we said about this? One of the nuanced outlooks on that subject was, some people, they look at it in black and white, and what do? They demonize, all right, so I'm against this movement, so I'm going to demonize anyone who associates as being gay or lesbian. They demonize them. And other people on the other side, in the other extreme, right, they demonize anyone who isn't accepting of their presence in society. And it should not be in such binaries. It should be, look, my deen teaches me this, and I accept and embrace that on a factual basis, legal basis. But when it comes to da'wah, my deen teaches me something else, to be very empathetic towards others, very accepting of people's differences and treating them with compassion. And then when it comes on a spiritual level, it also teaches me to deal with this issue just like I deal with other people facing other types of struggles. Right? Yeah, I disagree with it and I'm not going to embrace it and follow it, but I'm going to deal with it in a nuanced way. That's the whole point of this subject too. Wallahu a'lam.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. So I think we talked a little bit about the use of contraceptives. So on a related note, can Muslims defer having children?
Yeah, I think I addressed this issue. What do you guys say? Can Muslims defer having children? So the answer is yes, but with consent of who? Of both spouses. You know, that was the profound thing, because the Prophet ﷺ, he prohibited a husband from engaging in marital relations with his spouse with contraception meaning with azl, except with her permission, right? Except with her permission. And it goes the opposite way around too. So yeah, that's the answer to that question.
Jazakallah khair. So just to conclude, I know we're almost going to pray Salat al-Isha. You know, the subject of abortion is a difficult topic. So, Shaykh, what would you say if there was a Muslim woman or a couple that was considering abortion? It's obviously a difficult decision. What advice would you give them, give a couple that's considering abortion, and what kind of advice, or what should that couple consider doing to help them make this difficult decision?
Look, you know, I would say it's always a good rule of thumb to get a set of fresh eyes on your special circumstance and your specific situation. It's always a good idea to try to talk through whatever issue you're dealing with a third party, because you don't want it to tear apart your marriage. That's one. And you also don't want it to be a reason that leads you to being denied future blessings from Allah. You know, because sometimes if someone unreasonably acts in a circumstance or a relationship or in this type of situation of having a child, if someone unreasonably acts, then they may be denied a blessing that other people wish they had. Other people wish they had that. So talk through the specific circumstances and see if you really have a legitimate reason to abort, and have the discussion, and make sure whatever you come to is an area of consensus and ijma' between you and your spouse. Wallahu alam.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. I think we have a couple minutes before Salat al-Isha. Does anyone have any questions?
All right, just a quick question, because I think it's we pray at 10:10 today.
We will just take one question.
Yeah, I think he raised his hand first.
So, Shaykh, now within the vast spectrum of Islamic orthodoxy, from that orthodoxy and from those many perspectives, which position do you personally adhere to? And give, if you were to give a ruling, which one would you give it?
Basically, the way I deal with this is if it's an area of legitimate scholarly difference, then we have options, alhamdulillah. And that's why اختلاف أمتي رحمة واسعة. So this is a form of mercy that we have a multitude and spectrum of opinions in our deen. So that's what I would say to that. I would make use of whatever is a legitimate opinion and use it to address a specific circumstance. Wallahu alam. Jazakumullah khair. Inshallah, we're going to have adhan now and then salah. As we said, alhamdulillah, now we have this divider. So sisters, you can stay up here and you can pray. We're going to move the divider to where it was for Maghrib, and then we'll have adhan and iqamah. Jazakumullah khair.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
لا إله إلا الله. تفضل.
الله أكبر الله